The Bible's New Testament begins with the book of Matthew. Like the three books after it, known as the Gospels, it tells of the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Written in the latter half of the first century, many scholars and historians believe it was written by Matthew, one of the disciples of Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector in the area of Capernaum for the occupying Roman authority. He would have been wealthy and, as a tax collector, viewed with disdain due to the common corruption of the trade in that day. Bible teacher Michael Carr takes us on a journey to Israel, the land of the Bible, to explore the life, times, and words of Matthew, words that prove the identity of Jesus Christ as Messiah, and what that means to those who choose to follow him.
Welcome to a cold, gray Galilean morning. You don't think of it raining in the Gospels, but it rains here and it gets very cold like this morning. In this series of programs, we want to be listening to the Gospels. We want to learn to listen specifically to the Gospel of Matthew. Write this down. The best way to show someone you love them is to listen to them. It's not to do something for them. The best way to love your spouse is to listen to them. The best way to love your children is to listen to them. The best way to love God isn't to do something for Him, it's to listen to Him. The problem is some of us listen with our heads and some of us listen with our hearts. We think devotionally or we think theologically, and we neglect a bridge that connects our hearts and our minds, and that's our imagination. But the Bible is always reaching out, trying to recapture our imaginations. That's what parables do. That's what prophetic visions do. That's what apocalyptic literature does. And so that's what we're going to try to do in this series. We're going to try to learn to listen to the voice of Matthew, learn to hear what he has to say to us about this remarkable person who lived in this world, Jesus of Nazareth. It's a real privilege to be allowed into here to film this artifact from the first century. This is called the Jesus boat. In 1986, the Sea of Galilee was exceptionally low, and they found it in the mud, meticulously, dug it out and have restored it here. It's a great place to get an idea of the dimensions, the length and the breadth of the kind of boat that Jesus would have known. So if you're going to love someone, the best way to love someone is to listen to them. If you're going to love God, the best way to love God is to listen to His Word. And if you're going to engage with the disciples, if you're going to listen to the life of Jesus, you've got to learn to listen to the voices of each one of the Gospel writers, and they are all different voices. Mark is the simplest voice. He's interested in the emotional life of Jesus. Mark is telling Peter's story. Luke is a much more articulate voice, 700 words in Luke that aren't found anywhere else in the New Testament. And Luke is interested in the fact that Jesus is turning the world upside down. John is a much more mature voice. He's telling stories that he's been preaching and teaching for decades. So very different, in fact 92% unique, the Gospel of John. But Matthew is a completely different voice, and we have to ask some different questions of Matthew before we learn how to listen to the uniqueness of his voice. We're on the roof of the museum that contains the ancient Galilee boat, and here's a wonderful image of the Arbel with the clouds moving through. Just beautiful. So Matthew has a distinct voice. What's so distinctive about his voice? Well, there are four things, I think. First of all, Matthew is very interested in the words of Jesus. There are 5 big blocks of teaching in Matthew's gospel. He organizes his whole gospel around Jesus' teaching. Matthew is very interested in Jesus being the fulfillment of the Old Testament again and again. I mean, when Jesus moves, Matthew quotes a Bible verse to justify it. Matthew is very interested in the kingdom of God. And we'll see in a moment why that's so important in his message. But finally, I think most distinctive is Matthew's interest in identity. He's constantly asking the question, who is Jesus? What is his identity? But even more so, he's giving his first readers a new identity as they are losing theirs. There's a crisis in Galilee that we'll talk about. Matthew is the gospel of identity. The Galilee of Jesus' day is not the peaceful place that we sometimes think. It's a land in crisis. The Talmud, which is a collection of sayings of the rabbis, 20 volumes long, describes the Galileans as quarrelsome, troublesome and quarrelsome. Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was a famous rabbi of Jesus' era, laments at one point, "O Galilee, Galilee, thou who hatest the Torah." Galilee is very looked down upon. The Jews there are in conflict with each other, and of course the Romans are here. The conflict is going to boil over. The 2 major revolts that happened in Israel both of them started in Galilee. So Galilee is a land in crisis. But it's into that crisis that Jesus brings his ministry. He starts it here. And from this conflicted place, he and his disciples will move out and change the world.
We all come from different walks of life. We all face different concerns. But there's a place we can all turn to find hope and encouragement for our lives. Take the time to know God with our daily bread.
This is the synagogue in Chorazin. It's a city that Jesus visited because he refers to it, but we don't have any stories from this city. I like this place because this is a synagogue, and it's made out of the black basalt that the first century synagogue in Capernaum was made out of. So the synagogue where Jesus taught and did his miracles would have looked something like this. So that's why we're here. Remember, Galilee is a place in crisis, but the Jewish believers in Galilee, Matthew's first audience, they are also experiencing a crisis of identity. They're Christians who don't know they're Christians yet. They're faithful members of the synagogue community, and they will exist there till right around 70. I think Matthew was written just before or just after 70. What happens in 70? Jerusalem is destroyed, and Judaism, that had been many different things, very segmented in Jesus' time, Judaism becomes one thing. The prayers are all unified. The 18 benedictions are written. Number 12 of the 18 benediction is a curse. on Christians in the synagogue. So when we read Matthew's gospel, it's written to a group of people who are about to lose their identity. They've been a part of the Jewish community all their lives, and now that's going to be taken away from them. And Matthew has to tell them who they are all over again. Matthew's all about identity. He uses everything to establish, who is Jesus and who are we. Even the genealogy, sometimes we look at genealogies in the Bible and we think, oh, boring, just a list of names. But Matthew uses his genealogy. He's doing something with it. Now, Luke also has a genealogy tucked way into chapter 3 in Luke. Luke's not doing with his genealogy what Matthew is with his. Matthew divides his genealogy into 3 parts. The first part is Abraham, the second comes to David, and the third is the exile. He's organizing those generations to make a point, and it's all about the identity of Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. Jesus will sit on his father David's throne. And finally, the exile. What's that all about? Well, that ties back to the kingdom. Jesus is the one who will lead his people out of the exile and back to this new glorious kingdom that Matthew loves talking about. Matthew and Luke both tell us of the nativity of Jesus. Matthew is the very early nativity. Luke picks up later on. Luke tells us the story from Mary's point of view. Matthew tells us the point of view from Joseph's point of view. Now we know almost nothing about Joseph. We know he was a builder. He's described as a righteous man. But everything I need to know about Joseph, the Bible tells me about Joseph in Matthew's gospel. Because Matthew tells us that before the angel tells Joseph how it is that Mary became pregnant, before he finds out, he has already determined that he is not going to publicly humiliate her. That is, he's going to take upon himself, as it were, her guilt. That's all I need to know. Chapter 2 of Matthew picks up after the birth. For the first time we meet Herod the Great. He's a very, very important character in the gospel story. He's been king for over 30 years, but this is roughly the last year of his reign. He's sickly, he's dying, and he's insane. Now during his reign, he's lived with one great fear, and that is being replaced by another king. He's already killed his sons. He's killed his wife, who he actually loved. He's killed her mother, all to try to stay on the throne. He's built 3 enormous fortresses, Masada, the Herodium, and the Machaerus, all on his eastern border to prevent another king from coming. So imagine what happens to Herod now. A group of magi come from the east through that defended border, and they've come to announce a new king. It's his worst nightmare. Now he's going to slaughter the innocents of Bethlehem in one last vain attempt to wipe out this new king of the Jews. That's the world that Jesus is born into. Now when the Magi find Jesus, he's a toddler, he's a little boy, and he's already living in a house. With all their great wisdom, all the wisdom of the ancient world, something apparently was still missing in their hearts and in their minds. And when they find Jesus, Matthew tells us they fall down and they worship him. One more detail is very important. the Magi leave their gifts with Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now those gifts have a very important purpose. They're going to provide the financial basis for Jesus and Joseph and Mary when they escape to Egypt. They're going to be provided for by the wise men when they escape this insane, dying King Herod. This is a part of the Jordan River you don't often get to see. We're north of the Sea of Galilee. It's been raining a lot, and you can see it's flooding. It'll flow into the lake, and then it flows out the southern part of the lake down into Judea. That's where Jesus was actually baptized. So we want to talk about the baptism of Jesus. Now in all the Gospels, his ministry begins with the baptism. It establishes who he is, especially for Matthew, who cares so much about identity. When Jesus is baptized, he hears from the Father the perfect words that I love you, this is my beloved Son, and that I delight in you, that I'm pleased with you. Those are the two words that every child longs to hear from their father, and they define Jesus. Now in Matthew, there's a chapter break between the baptism and the temptation in the wilderness, and that's unfortunate because they really are the same story. They belong together. Because once Jesus' identity is spoken by the Father, he goes into the wilderness, and that identity is immediately tested by Satan. Remember what Satan says, if you're the Son of God, turn the stones into bread. If you're the Son of God, then leap off the temple. But Jesus knows who he is. He is confirmed in his identity from the Father. And finally, the last temptation, which had to have been the worst, Satan says, fall down before me and worship me. And Jesus refuses to do that because he knows who he is. He believes the identity that his Father has given him. He's loved and he's delighted in. So now the ministry is ready to start, and Jesus will move on into Galilee with his disciples.
It doesn't just happen. You go out day after day, week after week, month after month. Discipline is necessary for physical and spiritual growth. Sometimes it feels great. Other times, it hurts. But you keep at it. It takes time. And you make it a priority. It might not be easy, but it's worth it. Our Daily Bread can help you connect with God daily. Visit odb.org/fitness to learn more.
So Jesus is born, his identity is established in the wilderness, and he's ready for the mission to begin. So he begins calling disciples. They're walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he begins by calling two sets of brothers, 4 disciples. Peter and Andrew are fishing. He walks along, issues the call, follow me. Farther down the beach, James and John are there with their father. Same thing. We need to understand that when Jesus says, follow me, that's not an invitation to be weighed among other invitations. It's a command. You obey it or you don't. I think that explains why the disciples immediately would leave and all they had and follow him. So Peter and Andrew leave their nets. James and John leave their father. And they begin to change the world. They move up into the hillsides, into the synagogues, and eventually out into the open country of Galilee. And they begin teaching the good news of the kingdom. Remember, if we're going to engage with the Gospel of Matthew with our imaginations, we have to try to understand his first hearers. What was their world like? How is Matthew engaging with them? And there's a very important detail. It happened right around 70, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And that is, as Judaism was being reformed, the rabbis came up with what we call the 18 benedictions, the 18 blessings. And these are read 3 times a day, recited in the synagogue. Now, number 12 is not a blessing at all. It's actually a curse. It's a curse on the Menim. That's a term for heretics. In some versions, they're referred to as the Nazarenes, that is, the followers of Jesus. So put yourself in Matthew's listeners' position. They're living in a world. They are Jewish believers who don't know they're Christians yet. They're just faithful Jews in the synagogue who found the Messiah. And all of a sudden, a part of their service includes a curse on them, and they'll be driven out of the synagogue. That's the life situation of Matthew. Okay. In chapter 5, the ministry of Jesus is well underway. He's chosen the disciples. The ministry is spreading. Matthew tells us it's gone all the way to Syria. It's gone all the way to the Decapolis. Very successful. And so Jesus is going to come up on a mountainside, probably right around this area in the northern part of Galilee, and he's going to give his own benedictions. We call them Beatitudes. He's going to give 9 of them. They're all about the identity of his followers. And they talk about the new reality over against the old orthodoxy. The poor in spirit, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. See, he's describing Matthew's community. Blessed are the gentle, the meek, they'll inherit the earth. Blessed are those who are hungry for righteousness, because they're going to be filled. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. It's a sermon about identity. It's a sermon about the fact that the world's being turned upside down. There's a new reality where the poor and the hungry and those who are mourning are now blessed. It's all about the new kingdom that Matthew's so excited about. One of my favorite writers in history, a fascinating character named Pliny the Elder. He was roughly at the same time Jesus lived. He died when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. He wrote a massive work called The Natural History, and in that work he said, there's nothing more useful than salt and sunshine. Only in Matthew does Jesus say that we are the salt of the earth, that we are the light of the world. Now we know from John 8 that Jesus says he is the light of the world, but there's no contradiction there. You see how it works? Our identity is connected to Jesus' identity. Whenever I ask the New Testament, who am I? It always tells me who Jesus is. In chapter 6, Jesus teaches about the 3 pillars of Jewish piety: giving to the poor, prayer, and fasting. Unfortunately, in our time, we think those are optional, but in Judaism, they weren't considered an option. If you were observant, you would observe all 3 things. The problem is the Pharisees had started doing these things openly when they prayed on the street corner so everyone would see them. When they would give, they would announce it with trumpets, says Jesus. And when they fasted, they would disfigure their faces. But in the kingdom, in the new reality, these things are all to be done in secret, Jesus says. When you pray, you go into a room and you close the door. When you give to the poor, he says, you don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. It's all to be done in secret. But that's all right, because we serve a God who sees in secret, but who rewards us openly. I've always appreciated the simplicity of Jesus' teaching. He'll say, worry about this, don't worry about that. Be afraid of this, don't be afraid of that. In chapter 6, he brings up 2 things he tells his followers they shouldn't worry about: food and clothes. Very much the country person, he points to the well-fed birds, to the flowers that are clothed so beautifully. He tells his disciples, God takes care of those things. You don't have to worry about them. What you worry about is the kingdom. You focus on the kingdom, not food, not clothes, not even the future. In chapter 7 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus begins to conclude the first long block of teaching. 5 big blocks of teaching in Matthew, and this comes at the end of the first one. His first conclusion to his disciples is, do not judge. Now, if you think of it, when you're in a works righteousness culture, you need to judge. You need to judge other people. You need to judge yourself. But Jesus gives the liberating command that those days are over. It's a new reality, and you're free from judging other people. To make his point, he leaves us with an unforgettable image. The image is of a man with a beam protruding from his eye. It's almost a cartoon caricature. So here's this person with a beam sticking out of his eye, who at the same time is trying to take a small speck of dust out of someone else's eye. It's a ridiculous illustration to show the point of how judging no longer works. See, when you judge other people, you begin to have a harshness in your spirit, and you're unable to receive forgiveness. And Jesus doesn't want that from his followers. So the man with the beam in his eye, he's not blind to the speck in the other person's eye, but because of his judgmental spirit, he's blind to his own blindness.
We all come from different walks of life. We all face different concerns. But there's a place we can all turn to find hope and encouragement for our lives. Take the time to know God with our daily bread.